finishing our series on conversations with God. And I'm saying that in terms of prayer. We think about prayer, and you might have listened the last couple weeks, but just in case you're tuning in today for the first time, prayer is like dialogue. It's a conversation with God. It's not just God telling you something to do, and it's not you just giving God your wish list. It's dialogue. It's conversation, you listening, you talking, God talking, you listening. It's being present together. And we see the first couple conversations with God in the Bible was the very first one was with Adam when he ate the forbidden fruit. And if you didn't get to see that, I'd encourage you to go back 2 weeks to Valentine's Day. Watch that because it's about genuine love. Oof, so powerful. The second conversation with God was last week with Cain in Genesis chapter 4. And today's conversation with God is a pretty robust, really, really full conversation. And it's in Genesis chapter 15. Now, you may be listening and saying, Sarah, there were a lot more conversations with God that happened before Genesis chapter 15. What about? Like when God told Abraham, go to the land I'll show you in Genesis chapter 12, get up. What about Noah, right? I mean, like seriously, think about Noah. God told him to build an ark. And I can appreciate that you might think of those in terms of conversation. However, when God told him to do something, that's a command. That's an imperative. It's not a conversation. It's a direct obedience, do this. And so when I say conversation, it's this back and forth idea. It's communication. So the command to Noah did what God said. The command to Abram in Genesis chapter 12, move to a land that I'll show you. Abram mostly did that. But the conversation with God, the very first conversation with God you see between Abram and God is in Genesis chapter 15. And this chapter, full disclosure, honestly, this chapter seriously intimidates me. And it has for a long, long time, like years, probably maybe 2 decades. It's very intimidating to me. And you're like, why is that? Well, because this is the first time you watch this intimate covenant, cutting of a covenant between God and a human. You get the covenant in some respects with Adam back in the garden. You get covenant with a rainbow and Noah and all that. But this one is a level of intimacy that hasn't happened before. And it happens at the end of the chapter, the second half of the chapter. But the first half of the chapter is God conversing with Abram. And I think this is really fascinating with Abram because right out of the gate, God says to Abram, hey, I'm your shield, and you're going to have a great reward. And so Abram steps into the conversation. And he says, how can I know that? And I love this conversation because God speaks and starts the conversation with just a declaration, a statement. And in the past, when God started these conversations, it was a question. Where are you? Why are you upset? God asks a question. God initiates a conversation. God initiates this conversation as well. But now, for the first time, man is asking the question. How will I know this? How will I know that you're my shield, that I have a great reward? How do I know this? Because I don't have any offspring. And so the dialogue starts, and God begins to speak to Abram and say, hey, and I love what happens here. When Abram asks the question, how will I know this? I love that God doesn't say, well, because I'm God, you idiot. How come you can't even just get it right with faith? God doesn't do any of that shame, none of that accusation, none of that. How come you should know? But he doesn't do any of that stuff. I like that God can take our questions. How will I know? How's that going to happen? And our concerns and even maybe a little bit of some of our doubts or hesitations or reluctance. And that doesn't put God off. In fact, God says, hey, let's go take a walk. Oh my gosh, I love this. And I love that God takes a walk with Abram and he shows him the stars of the sky. And he says, hey, can you count all of that? And Abram's like, whew, there's a boatload of stars up there. And God says, your offspring will be, if you could count the stars in the sky, that's how numerous your offspring will be. And I just want to encourage you today, just a simple couple little takeaways here. Do the conversation with God. And maybe as you walk throughout your day, you would include God in your daily walk. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, we walk a lot of places. Some of us have a car, some of us don't. Some of us ride the bus. But no matter what, we're going to walk. We're going to do some kind of walking today. We might walk to the parking lot. We might walk to the bus. We might walk to our desk at work. We might walk to a classroom. But we all will walk. And you say, well, I'm in a wheelchair. Okay, you're going to wheel. You're going to, some way or another, get yourself to the next place. And I would encourage you that throughout this day, let's think in terms of walking with God. Walking and talking. Some of the best and most rich conversations I've had with God have been on just taking a walk, like a 20-minute, 30-minute walk down to the fire station, back to my house, or down to the pond, down the street, and back to my house. Those walks with God have been so phenomenal to facilitate talking with God. And when you walk with God, let's also let God adjust your perspective. And Abram did that. He took a walk with God, and he got his eyes off of the horizontal, off of what he knew and his limits and the boundaries of finite existence. Because when you have a conversation with God, let's remember, you're conversing with infinite. And so God isn't limited by what you see, you feel, or the boundaries, or the doctor's report, or the grade you, whatever. God is infinite. And so you're having conversation with infinite, and when God says, let me change your vision, let me help you lift up your eyes, then agree to that and say, okay, God, I appreciate the horizontal and the finite, but I also know that when I talk with you, I'm talking with infinite. And there's nothing impossible with God, Luke 1:37. Letting God change your vision, your focus, your perspective, that God can do anything. Nothing is impossible with God. So I just encourage you today, in your conversations with God, take a walk. Let God change your focus. And then finally, it says Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Believe God. Choose to believe before you have to understand. You may not understand, probably won't understand everything God has for you or God says to you, but believe, make that the top priority, more important than what you understand or what makes sense to you or what's logical. Choose to believe, because then that's when the conversation goes even deeper, richer, more full, and that's when you begin to see God initiate this covenant, this amazing, intimate covenant with Abram, after Abram chose to believe, even though he may not understand everything. So I think these are really powerful lessons for us. If you get a chance, read Genesis 15, kind of blow your mind. It's a pretty astounding chapter. Thanks again for watching. Oh my goodness, love to get some feedback. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Subscribe, that would be fantastic. And I'd encourage you could share this with a friend. That would be magnificent. We're going to start a new series here coming up in March, so it's going to be fresh and springy. I know, because it's March, right? We think about spring. And here's your concluding joke. Why is it that skeletons never play church music? Wait for it. Because they don't have any organs. I know, right? You're like, maybe. All right, catch you next week. Thanks again for watching our Conversations with God.